Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last panel of the conference. Traditionally, the conference closes with a panel on literature, and it's wonderful to see how the literature field has expanded over the years in the conference, because today we have the largest panel ever, largest of the conference and largest panel on literature we've ever had. With a fantastic range of topics covering the period from the 19th to the 21st century. And I'm very honored to welcome our first presenter, Alana Felton. Just a second.
Slides, yeah.
Alana, let me just introduce Alana first. Alana is a PhD candidate in Slavic languages and literatures at Yale University, where she is completing a dissertation on digitally mediated culture and resistance in Belarus, expected in June 2025. She earned her BA in Slavic Studies from Brown University in 2018 and spent the following year as a Fulbright English teaching assistant in Vitebsk, Belarus. For the 2024-25 academic year, she holds a Fulbright Schumann grant to conduct dissertation research in the European Union. In July 2025, she will join Pomona College as Assistant Director of College Writing. And the topic of Alana today is Misunderstanding as Memory from Bakhushevich to Baharevič. Over to you, Alana.
Oh. Okay.
Sorry, for some reason it's not showing that.
Okay. That's okay. I'll just hold it.
Oh, maybe if we touch, no.
Everything's frozen up there.
Please stick to 15 minutes per presentation, and then we'll have a discussion.
And now there's live there.
The presentation isn't terribly important, so while we do this, I can just go ahead and get started to avoid running over time. Thank you for the introduction. I want to just note that this is the beginning of a project for me. I'm working on something totally different for my dissertation and decided to take a little bit of a mental and emotional break from that and turn to something else. So I'm really excited to get feedback and thoughts from folks regarding that. So the focus of my presentation today will mostly be the 2014 novel by Alana Bakhushevich, Dzieci Alandarki, or Alandarka's Children. So according to Alana Bakhushevich, he wrote his 2014 novel, Alandarka's Children, using 5 languages: literary Belarusian, colloquial Belarusian, literary Russian, colloquial Russian, and Trasyanka. Rather than clarifying meaning, this polyglot approach destabilizes it, inviting all readers, fluent or not, into a space where misunderstanding is, to varying degrees, inevitable. Bakhushevich further complicates comprehension by blending genres. Borrowing from fantasy, dystopia, and satire, the novel draws on Belarusian history and contemporary politics, Jewish mythology, and German fairy tales, creating a veritable cacophony. It also involves Belarusian, Russian, and Soviet literary and cultural references. Using Alandarka's Children as a case study, I argue that misunderstanding is not just a byproduct of complexity, but a narrative strategy that develops a decolonial literary aesthetics. This decolonial aesthetics offers a way of remembering that acknowledges and honors the pluralism inherent to Belarusian history, culture, and literature. As my examination of Bakhurevich's novel will show, the figure of Alandarka is central to articulating a subjectivity and mode of remembering and imagining futures that resist simplification, embracing opacity and misunderstanding as generative modes of decolonial memory and subaltern speech. In what follows, I first provide a brief overview of the novel's plot, and then I examine how linguistic misunderstanding destabilizes meaning, linking it to Jacques Rancière's idea of literary misunderstanding. I then turned to Edouard Glissant's theory of opacity to explore how the novel positions misunderstanding as an ethical and effective narrative strategy. I conclude with a brief reflection on the potential affective impact of the novel. Okay, great, thank you. The title, Alandarka's Children, alludes to the protagonist of the poem Things Will Be Bad, Kiepsko Budze, by the late 19th century Belarusian poet Franciszek Bakhushevich. In the poem, a Polish-speaking Catholic priest instructs Belarusian-speaking peasants to consult the calendar, kalendarka as he says, to name their infant son. Misunderstanding him, the parents think he is telling them to name the boy Alandarka. Although Alandarka is not a real name, it becomes one. And this unfortunate character becomes an embodiment of misfortune, of misunderstanding, of a linguistic accident in imperial space where linguistic and religious differences, as well as class disparities and power imbalances, render miscommunication and misunderstanding the norm. As the title of the poem suggests, things are bad for Alandarka throughout his life. He is born into a poor peasant family in the particularly inauspicious and hungry month of March. He is given an invalid river baptism, orphaned, wrongfully arrested and imprisoned, abused by family and the state. Despite, or rather precisely because of his unlucky origins and unfortunate life, Alandarka has become a central figure in the Belarusian literary imagination. One Belarusian literary scholar even describes him as Belarus in human form. So contemporary poet Maria Matskevich argues that Alandarka's cultural resonance derives from his status as a, quote, loser, neodachnik, writing. Quote, the loser is a pervasive hero of the Belarusian sociocultural space, starting with Kastus Kalinowski, who failed miserably. They say that history is written by winners. The history of Belarus is an exception. It was written by losers. Our unofficial classics are also complete failures. However, with the sum of their failures, they created the context of our existence, and this is their most important success, unquote. Here she's being satirical. She's not literally referring to Kalinowski as a loser, right? But what she's saying is that we have to look at Belarusian history to understand it authentically, not from the quote, the winner's perspective, which would be the colonial powers, right? So I just want to, so she writes in a tone that's somewhat satirical, in an article, an essay that is rather satirical. And I see in her observation an opportunity to read the quintessential loser figure as an embodiment of a historical consciousness shaped by marginalization, misunderstanding, and rupture. Alandarka's profoundly misunderstood existence complicates the oversimplified hero-loser binary that prioritizes dominant, primarily colonial historical narratives. Set in post-Soviet Belarus, Alandarka's Children follows a young girl named Sia and her mysterious brother, Aviator, or Lyotchik in Belarusian. In English, it's usually rendered as Avi for short. Who they both escape from a state-run re-education camp, and with help from their father, who is simply referred to throughout as father. The camp is run by a doctor with questionable morals and even more questionable methods aimed at curing, and he aims to cure children of speaking Belarusian and train them to speak proper Russian, an allegory for the systematic repression of Belarusian language and culture. Sia's father is obsessed with preserving the Belarusian language, the mova, as it's referred to throughout, and raises her to speak only Belarusian, seeing her as a means of preserving linguistic and cultural identity. Avi, her brother, materializes from a bag of wet clay one day and is secretly a golem figure drawn from Jewish folklore and embodies forgotten or repressed cultural memory. These two very strange children wander through a surreal, often grotesque landscape, encountering parodic figures who either mock or erase Belarusian language and various versions of contemporary Belarusian identity. The novel ends with the character of Avi sacrificing himself to save Sia, who is then taken by her estranged mother to Germany to be re-educated in Russian and German and live a sort of foreign life. In the second chapter of the novel, this will be my case study for the sake of time, there's a quintessential scene of misunderstanding that unfolds across multiple levels. After breaking Sia and Avi out of the camp, their father loses them somewhere in the dense Belarusian forest. And after giving up his search to find them, he checks himself into a dilapidated hotel where he drinks vodka and imagines Sia's future. In this future, she lives abroad and she's engaged to be married to a foreigner. He imagines her speaking with her fiancé in a foreign language, trying to explain to him her peculiar upbringing. Her fiancé responds with confusion and skepticism, and as well as dismissal, saying things like, "Oh, what nonsense, you and your endless riddles." As their imagined conversation continues, she tells her fiancé about reading her father's diaries years after they last saw each other. Reading his diary, she feels estranged from him, but more so estranged from herself and her own past. At least she feels that she doesn't know the self that is described from her father's perspective, written in Belarusian years earlier. She says, quote, "I got the feeling that it wasn't me he was writing about. It was about some other little girl and about a different country, not the one I came from," end quote. She offers to read part of her father's diaries to her fiancé in translation, of course, and says, quote, "True, it'll be a translation, but then translation is a way of avenging yourself on language for what it has done, because there's no end to it and because it's so powerful," end quote. His response is again confusion and even scorn to a certain degree. He says, quote, "I've lost you again. You can't say it like that in our language. It sounds strange," end quote. This dense passage is just layers of misunderstanding on top of misunderstanding. The whole scene is imagined by father, but the future he imagines renders him strangely absent. The scene falls at the beginning of the novel when the reader does not yet know why Sia would be in a foreign country where she is alienated from her father, her mother tongue, and her younger self. Moreover, the entire dialogue is rooted in misunderstanding. Her fiancé fails to comprehend her metaphors and her history, and the reader is caught in a disorienting narrative frame. They're left unsure whether to read the scene as some sort of prophecy by a sort of drunken father, as a drunken hallucination, or as foreshadowing for a future event that will happen in the novel. In this way, Bakhushevich makes misunderstanding more than simply a theme. It's a destabilizing force embedded in the novel's very structure. This accumulation of misunderstandings reflects what Jacques Rancière terms literary misunderstanding. In his 2003 essay, Literary Misunderstanding, he argues that literature is more than a means of transmitting messages or expressing intentions. Rather, literature creates, quote, "a space where worlds no longer belong to anyone, where meanings are no longer fixed, and where the reader is invited to participate in the construction of sense," end quote. Misunderstanding in this view deliberately creates moments of confusion that force readers to contend with pluralism, unclear boundaries, messy histories, and with the reality that they lack the ability to comprehend everything. In this space, misunderstanding is not a failure, but a condition of possibility. It destabilizes interpretation, disrupts authority, and invites the reader to actively construct sense amid confusion. Bakhushevich novel enacts this disorientation and confusion in both form and content. The imagined scene between Sia and her fiancé produces no definitive resolution. This is true throughout the entire novel. Every character is flawed and contradictory. No stable ideology prevails. The reader's inability to fully understand them, whether due to limited information, unreliable narration, or linguistic estrangement, is not an accident. Instead, for Bakhushevich, misunderstanding is a narrative strategy that resists closure, thereby encouraging reflection and discourse. If Rancière helps us understand misunderstanding as generative and meaning-making, Edward Glissant extends its significance into the ethical and political realm. In his book, Poetics of Relation, Glissant insists on what he calls the, quote, "right to opacity," end quote. The idea that individuals and cultures, especially those impacted by colonial violence and erasure, should not be forced to render themselves fully intelligible to others. Basically, they have a right to be misunderstood. To do so would mean interpreting, when rendering ourselves totally comprehensible to others, we often have to hide bits of ourselves or reinterpret things in ways that aren't true to our own experience. And so what he's arguing is that interpreting history to fit a dominant framework or ideology often overlooks key elements of cultural memory and experience. He says, his sort of iconic quote is, "We demand the right to opacity for everyone." By this, he refuses universal understandings of transparency that obliterate difference. In Alan Darker's Children, Bakhushevich exercises the right to opacity, the right to be not easily understood through persistent miscommunication, linguistic confusion, unreliable narrators, and just disjointed timelines. No one, not the reader nor the characters, fully understands anyone else or, in many instances, themselves. In writing a novel encoded with misunderstanding at the level of form and content, Bakhushevich refuses to make Belarusian culture fully accessible to outsiders, or even to all Belarusians. He forces all readers to sit with and consider the complexity of Belarusian identity and history. This opacity is not simply the byproduct of post-Soviet fragmentation. It's an intentional refusal to make Belarusian identity legible purely on oversimplified imperial or even political terms. Bakhushevich does not seek to restore a coherent cultural self. He depicts its incompleteness, its miscommunications, its haunting illegibility, as a way of asserting a form of relation that does not depend on mutual comprehension, but sort of calls for respect despite misunderstanding. This way of relating to Belarusian culture as a foreigner, as someone who is part of it, engenders respect for the complex narratives and language inherent to Belarusian culture. There is also an affective dimension to Bakhushevich opacity. Misunderstanding in Alan Darker's Children generates not just narrative confusion, but has the potential to trigger emotions like shame, sadness, and estrangement. This enacts how colonial power has not just suppressed language, but has severed people from their own cultural memory and identity. Misunderstanding thus becomes a form of decolonial memory, one that works narratively, affectively, and ethically, and that has the potential to provoke reflection and even action. So my provisional conclusion, as I noted, this is a very early project for me, is this. Misunderstanding is not merely a recurring trope in Belarusian literature. Alan Darka is more than just a sort of iconic figure. It's a deliberate narrative strategy. In Alan Darka's Children, it functions as a decolonial aesthetic that disrupts certainty, embraces opacity, and invites disagreement and discomfort. It also honors the complexity of cultural loss and the strange, persistent power of stories told by and about marginalized voices. As the title suggests, all the characters in the novel are Alan Darker's children, left to navigate these complex memories, histories, and identities. The novel also invites Belarusian readers to consider themselves in this light, as well as through its affective dimensions. I plan to develop this argument and plan on drawing on things like Akudovich's idea of kod odsutnosti and things like that. And I welcome your feedback and critique as I continue this work.
Thank you very much, Alana. We are now moving on to our second presenter, Hanna Komar. Hanna is a Belarusian poet, writer, translator, and performer. She's published 5 poetry collections, including the most recent Reborn, and a non-fiction book about the experience of being incarcerated for peaceful protest in Belarus. Hanna is a member of PEN Belarus and an honorary member of English PEN. Freedom of Speech 2020 Prize laureate from the Norwegian Authors Union. She is currently taking a PhD at the University of Brighton, exploring how poetry can support Belarusian women to share experiences of domestic abuse and state violence. Over to you, Hanna.
Thank you, Karalina, for introducing me. And hello, everyone. As you can hear, I'm mostly a poet. And I was mostly a poet in 2023 when I started a PhD, which I had never, ever thought of doing before that. And it was a necessity. And I felt completely unequipped and alien in academia. But now I'm in my third year, and I'm able to do that due to my approach, which is a poetic, feminist, familial autoethnography. Sounds mysterious probably to some of you. Yeah, I hope we'll... Anyway, so what is poetic autoethnography? What is autoethnography? It's a research method that uses personal experience to describe and interpret cultural texts, experiences, beliefs, and practices. Autoethnographers believe that personal experience is infused with political and cultural norms and expectations, and they engaged in rigorous self-reflection in order to identify and interrogate the intersections between the self and social life. So in simple terms, I draw on personal and familial experiences of domestic abuse and state violence to talk about wider social, cultural, and political issues. By doing so, I demonstrate how personal trauma is not isolated, but rather ingrained in the structures and patriarchal ideology. Why familial autoethnography, and what does it even mean? I know that I best tell about the experience that I've either lived myself or witnessed very closely. So sharing the experience, along with my own experience, my mother's and sister's experience, felt like a natural choice. An autoethnographic exploration of our familial experience of domestic and state violence enables me to examine gender-based violence and patriarchy, questions of victimhood and agency, and the influence of social, political, economic, and cultural factors on women's lives in Belarus. It also opens a path toward exploring how we might resist or heal from such injustices. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I missed a page. Anyway, I'll finish here and I'll return to a poem that I wanted to share. And this research is also an attempt to bring my mother and sister. Well, I can't return home, so I haven't seen my mother and sister for a while, right? So, and there is a concept, Marilyn Mata uses a concept of a place of flourishing, what she calls a place of flourishing, where a mother who experienced domestic violence and her children who either also experience it or at least witness it, they can live together in peace and love beyond survival and beyond trauma. So my work is an attempt to bring my mother and sister in that space together with me, at least symbolically. And back to autoethnographic poetry. Yeah, and how I use poetry in this research is I both use poems that have already been written by myself or other Belarusian women poets to illustrate some of the statements that I make, but I also write new poetry. And autoethnographic poetry is something that I've been doing before I even knew the name autoethnographic. For example, so poems about domestic abuse, patriarchy, state violence, they're for me autoethnographic. And I'll read that poem that I wrote ages ago as an illustration of that. You get kicked off the bus, drunk. I press my doll to my chest and stay silent. I smile at your friends, those drunkards and fools, like I'm good, and stay silent. You dig the fork into the flesh of your arm. I hand you a towel and stay silent. I bang on the neighbor's door to protect my sister and mom and stay silent. I watch you sleep where you fell, breaking chairs in our hearts and stay silent. As you are growing old and breaking down, I am silently healing my wounds. Your good daughter. But it's not just this kind of poems that I'm included in this work. The next poem is a warmer one that I wrote in the process of this familial autoethnography. It sounds a bit childish, but I think that's the entire point of it. I'm always 17, just like my mama. I love to laugh, just like my mama, to sing and dance, just like my mama. But I barely ever laugh, just like my mama. I walk lost in thoughts, just like my mama. I live as if in a dream, just like my mama. I sing and dance rarely, just like my mama. Both me and my mama sleep uneasily in different parts of the world. We ask one another about the weather there. My mama and I both like the sun, although she's Leo and I'm Pisces. I'll order some gladioli for her birthday, as pretty and brave as my mama. So, and the next is, what is feminist autoethnography? Sorry. Naples defines feminist research as conceptualizing reality that reflects women's interests and values and draws on women's own interpretation of their experiences. While working this research, I encountered a number of challenges, and one of them is, how do I share silent stories without reinforcing silence? In the context of domestic violence, Meta writes that if every aspect of women's and children's lives and bodies has been invaded and controlled by the brutal forms of power and control, then recovery work should be equally invasive in tenderness and freedom. So within my research, this requires a commitment to relational ethics, which means being transparent about the conflicting feelings I might have when writing about my family members, refusing to blame my mother for not complying with my ideals, and representing her with care and respect. One method I chose to enact relational ethics is a conversation, but I won't stop here. So another element of relational ethics is writing about my mother with love and care, without blame and patriarchal labels, seeing her for an individual with her own life, needs, and voice. Meta also says that women are conditioned to wish for a perfect mother, and this is a patriarchal construct. And I've seen that in myself too. An expectation that my mother had to be a perfect human and always make the right choices, not tolerate an abusive husband, and shield her daughters from that violence, that she was supposed to be intelligent and wise, supportive, and never be scared, and never project her fears and insecurities on us. Sounds like very high demands. And the next poem is called To Mom, and in that I think that tendency you can see very clearly. It's also an earlier poem that I wrote before this research. Your cables stretch all the way to me, and current flows in them. It was not you who created them, nor laid them out. You are not the engineer-in-chief. You wouldn't even be a good electrician, because you'd tie loose wires in knots and cause accidents. Not even an electric pole, because you're unreliable. You must be a wire, and I must be its continuation. Together we are part of an endless electrical circuit. Most people can only be consumers of electricity, but you and I have no right to break. We must endure power surges, flocks of birds, changes of weather. We must look after the insulation and never allow wires to fray. Where you end, I begin. We are carriers of the current vital for life. We didn't choose the fate. It chose us. I'm not blaming you that I'm no current, that I'm just a wire. I'm not blaming you for anything at all. I'm not. I kiss your wrinkles, stroke your hair. I forgive you and let it all go. Meta suggests that changing this attitude to mother and daughter relationship can shake the foundations of patriarchy. The deeper I've gone into the feminist research, the more I've used language as a tool to transform damaging narratives into ones that hold space for love, care, empathy, respect, and healing. In the following poem, also written within my research, I share memories that might sound like resentful at first glance, but they are only a setting to tell some of my mom's story, calling for compassion for her experience. You were eating an onion as if it was an apple, sitting on the little step between the kitchen and the balcony. Oof, how can you eat it like this? I made a face. And you told me that you'd loved eating onions like that since you were young. You also told me that a bashed knee isn't painful, and a scratched palm isn't painful, and carrying weight isn't heavy. You carried so many when you were young. Sacks with grain, sacks of cement. Giving birth That's what's painful. You continued, not noticing my tear and snot. You were eating that onion like an apple, sitting on the step of our kitchen, as if it was the step of a village house. You were eating an onion, and I was crying. It's been incredible to observe how this research transformed me in my relationship with Mom, how I've become kinder, more compassionate to my mother and to myself because we are so interconnected. And to conclude, poetic, familial, feminist autoethnography is an intuitive, ethical way to share Belarusian women's experience of violence that values personal and vulnerable stories and explores the multiplicity of women's experiences. It is reflective of the challenges that we face when writing about traumatic experiences involving the people close to us. It opens space for healing through language, through relationship, and through the courage of speaking aloud what has long remained unspoken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanna, and thank you for sticking to the 15 minutes limit.
Slides.
Our next presenter is joining us online. Natallia Pazniak. Natallia, are you there?
Я зараз поспробую презентацію запрезентувати. Не веду
Yeah, I will introduce you to begin with. Natallia Pazniak is a philologist and translator. She studied Belarusian and Slavic studies in Belarus, Poland, and Germany. For several years, she worked as the chair of Belarusian literature at the Francisc Skaryna State University in Gomel. She has also held short-term lectureships at the University of Potsdam and the University of Greifswald, and is currently a research assistant at the Institute of Slavic Studies at the University of Graz, Austria. Since October 2023, she has been working on her dissertation on polyglossia in East Slavic literatures at the Graduate Center for the Study of Culture, Justus Liebig University, Gießen. Her research interests include urbanity, totalitarian legacies, and multilingualism in contemporary literature and culture in Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland. Over to you, Natallia.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please.
Sorry, can you also introduce your title, because I haven't done so?
Віддать мою презентацію або ні є? Валіна?
Так.
Yes, yeah. Okay. Okay. Ich beginne. Contemporary Belarusian literature is a transcultural space and the meeting point for post-imperial discourse of the West and the East. Such a culture's border of the as an transnational phase in the development of the post-communities cultures, or as a still silent periphery of some larger formation, can be productively studied in the context of the complex phenomenon of polyglossia. Polyglossia is nominally seen as the result of wars and colonization, but also of fruitful cultural and trade contacts between ethnic groups and states. This in turn allows us to use the concept of central and peripheral language to talk about military literature written in supercentral language, or say the decentralization of the main language, to distinction between the locality contact and super-regional literature. However, the choice of language for contemporary Belarusian literature is not only expression of geopolitical self-position, but also the result of censorship, the background and education of writers, as well as implicit readers, and finally of the possibility of book publication. Then the Belarusian independent and the rise of Lukashenko's authoritarian regime, the language of policy in Belarus has undergone numerous changes. The course of toward are national revival and Belarusian with abstractly replaced measures to reduce the shape of the Belarusian language, cultural, and education segment in favor of the Russophone one. Another choice of so-called soft Belarusian and bilingualism ended with the suppression of the mass protests in 2020. Choosing contemporary Belarus as the many multilingual country are characterized by unfinished process of state building. The choice of language is a politically motivated destination of effort. As such, it often encourages the creation of literature in which the language itself becomes a literal canon. My first point as the Belarusian language is used by many contemporary writers as a symbolic instrument of resistance to the authoritarian regime, which labels the Belarusian language as the national. Indeed, over the past that used, native speakers who actively use Belarusian language in Belarus can be described as the discriminated minority. On the other hand, after the beginning of Russia's aggression against Ukraine 2022, many Russian speakers and intellectuals in Belarus, the use of the Russian language has become a symbol of imperial hegemony and a symbol of the language of the oppressed. Just as it was in the early 1990, at the same time, it remains the language of the majority of the Belarusian population. The intensive polemic between Russophone and Belarusian authors, for example, dispute over the words of Nobel Prize Russophone writer Svetlana Alexievich, and the ideas of cultural and linguistic regionalism they have between development since early 1990 are clearly visible in the literature text of contemporary Belarusian writers. The most prominent example of this trend are the increasing attachment to legitimizing the so-called Polynesian language, with the attention part was some outer to micro-language usage in church origin. Over the translation of the forward language, usually English, German, or Polish, and also observed in the work of authors who were forced to immigrant or who faced censorship destruction in Belarus. For example, there is still to Belarus version of the books about protests in Belarus, written by Yulia Timofeeva and Autoethnographic and Tatiana Artemovich. On even the Belarusian language, both the Cyrillic and Latin alphabets. For many Belarusian uses, this represented a symbolic geopolitical choice between West and East, civilization that has existed for at least a couple of centuries. The further complications of the difference is ostrographic systems, as called Matskevich and Polakowa, and the existence of at least 5 increasingly divergent forms of Belarusian literary language, which non-Belarusians use very constantly. Events follow a will focus on the work of contemporary Belarusian writer Tobaharevič, which I will treat as an electron exemplar of the process described above. To write the first literary experiment for the time of the literary group Boom can already give us idea of the emerging conflict of identities based on instrumentalization of language. In Baharevich's poem Немецкая мова, for example, the Soviet and post-Soviet narrative of love for the Belarusian language, which at the same time mobilization is sometimes ornamental and deconstruction are biting parody. Towards this end, the author substitution in Belarusian language from the German one, while retaking the original logical pattern. For linguistic agent Translation, German, Belarusian, and Russian, on the first interaction also underpin the plot of one Bakhushevich first story, Günther Waldhof, его кредиторы. The post-imperial linguistic situation is also vividly represented in Bakhushevich short novel Приватный пляж на узбережье Леты, or even more explicitly in novel Alendarka's Children. The narrator of the short novel event as escapist project aimed to preserve the mythical Kudin language, which can be read as metaphor for the definitive national project. In Alendarka Chinda, the language policy instead as an antagonism between evil doctor who tries to save children from fear Belarusian language, who means FO surgical operation in the protagonist, attempt to save the Belarusian speakers from the imperialist doctor himself. She impostedly of belonging to only one of the linguistic community in modern Belarus, although finds is empathic expression in Pryazhko, which is a number of Bakhushevich characters. In novel of Dog of Europe, extension in impossible litigating rituals politicization of language leads to your Autoethnographic project, an artificial language of Balbuta. The beginning of the last part of the novel is written in the language and the reader invested on the grammar book and dictionary described in meeting. Balbuta was originally invited of the island of Gotland in October 2017 and has most in communities with Lucian and Esperanto, which was quite popular in Soviet Belarus. Since 2017, we can trace the process of instrumentalization of Balbuta among people who, in own way, authors are in contact with Bakhushevich. Recently, some poems have been written and translated in Balbuta. Dmitry Strozer, Kristina Bandurina, Dmitry Rubin. Two songs performed in Balbuta, for example, both band Syndrome Samozvanca, and tradition can began in Minsk and then move to Germany. Finally, chooses community of Balbuti. Balbuta also exists in the virtual space of social network since 2023 to this event an online translator of Balbuta. Conceived as an egocentrical author project and represented a new cryptography of modern Belarus Balbuta can simply be read a temple to escape to oppressive post-colonial coordinates in which both Russian and Belarusian have to exist. At the same time, paradoxically, it also embodies the increasing political of linguistic horse in modern Belarus. In this coordination, language itself and the discourse of language choice become not only objects of textual reflection, but also political device of use deconstruct multi-linguistic entities and such as linguistic mask. Such constructions represent a special case of post-colonial hybridity, which characterized by the impossibility of defining one's identity by the social and political cause of the dominant culture or by the national cause of the chosen culture, and at the same time by the inevitability of voice. Thank you so much.
Have you finished?
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Natallia. And now we are moving on to our fourth presenter, Maria Polakowa, who is a researcher specializing in contemporary Russian and Belarusian drama within its historical, political, social, and cultural contexts. She completed her graduate studies and taught at Silesian University in Poland. At present, she researches Belarusian drama of the 21st century at the University of Warsaw. Maria is the author of numerous publications on the work of Pavel Pryazhko, Sergei Kovalyov, Ivan Verypayev, Diana Balyka, and others that explore the evolution of theatrical narratives, providing critical perspectives on modern playwrights and dramatic expression. Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Maria.
I just wanted to mention that I'm based in London for the last 12 years, but still maintaining connections to Warsaw University, where I have my, well, I can say mentor, Professor Matskevich, who also a good friend of, as far as I know, the library. And he also did a lot to make it more public about Belarusian playwrights. He translated a lot and published in Poland at his university. But also I know that he completed a book thanks to help of the museum and library, 20 and 30s literacy, I think, of 20th century, right? Anyway, let's go to my topic. It's a childhood and youth in the world of Pavel Pryazhko. I changed a little bit. I planned first to present two plays, but because we don't want to make it too long, I just shrunk to one. So let's see. Childhood is often seen as a carefree time, yet this view overlooks deep psychological and social pressures. Introjection, the unconscious absorption of parental attitude, shapes emotional and cognitive development. Meanwhile, children navigate peer group dynamics and social acceptance struggles that deeply affects their sense of identity. This influence particularly stark in post-Soviet Belarus due to the widespread impact of mass incarceration, which included both criminals and political prisoners. The resulting trauma and normalization of prison culture shaped society across generations. Hierarchical structures and prison language became deeply ingrained, reinforced by broader socio-political pressures. Leaders also prioritizing ideological of conformity over intellectualism, encouraging consumer-driven values while suppressing independent thought. This deliberate distortion reshaped societal norms and deeply influenced childhood experience. A deep understanding of childhood requires us to challenge enduring myths and engage with its complexities in a way that reflects historical and societal realities rather than comforting illusions. This complex theme is powerfully explored in the work of playwright Pavel Pryazhko, particularly in his play Third Shift. You might know it by Third Period, translated differently. Here quoting, childhood, which brings tears to everyone's eyes, at the mere thought of it is, according to Pryazhko, a grand deception. Socially, it is totalitarianism. Biologically, it is competition among males for the right to possess a female. Mythologically, it is the ancient world of predestination. In other words, children represent the future laden with the past. Just like adults, they betray for pittance, believe in mysticism, and are just as sexually dependent. The only difference is their innocence, which grants them impunity, and therein lies in sweetness of childhood. End quote. I will omit here some details about Pryazhko for now, perhaps for later discussion. For the moment, just a few words. He is considered part of so-called Belarusian phenomenon in dramaturgy. He has developed a long-standing and fruitful collaboration with Dmitry Volkostrelov, the founder and director of Theatre Post in St. Petersburg, who has directed many of his plays. In 2020, 2 volumes of his works, along with interviews featuring and discussing him, were published in Moscow. And at this point, I would like to highlight the words of leading drama researcher and theater critic Pavel Rudnev, who examined Pryazhko's plays in numerous articles and also in his book, Drama of Memory. Here quoting, "Belarusian Pavel Pryazhko provokes noisy, passionate reactions, either condemnation or admiration. Today, he is the most discussed contemporary playwright in Russia, and among his generation, the most produced. Moreover, his radicalism has proven to be sought after not only on avant-garde platforms, but also in more traditional dramatic stages across the Russian provinces. Pavel Pryazhko successfully altered the trajectory of contemporary playwriting in Russia, shifting new drama from a dramaturgy of themes to dramaturgy of language, fostering discussion around the very structure of modern play itself." End of quote. The events depicted by Pryazhko's play take place at night in a pioneer camp with the protagonist, children aged 13 to 15, engaging in activities typical for their age and setting. The play, spin the bottle, argue and reconcile, experiment with smoking and drinking, and have pillow fights. The author deliberately places the characters in an environment atypical for their everyday lives. The camp, where they are gathered together with minimum adult supervision outside of school and family, provides an opportunity to observe the rules and dynamics govern their world more clearly. The only adult present is the nanny, a figure of fear and control through physical punishment. She pulls the boy's ear so hard upon catching him on the corridor after light out that it remained red and sticking out for quite some time, which he later proudly demonstrated to everyone as a kind of battle scar, proof of his rule breaking, which earns him status among his peers. At first glance, the dialogues and scenes appear amusing, but they ultimately present an unflattering portrayal of adolescence. The characters often speak in awkward and grammatical phrases, using slang that reflects a limited vocabulary, a lack of cultural polish, and a tendency to imitate adults. Notably, this behavior is shared by all characters, regardless of personality, social background, or level of maturity. This is perhaps why the phrase that serves as a kind of motto in the play, expressing how children see themselves, shaped by their surroundings, is repeated through. Bloody hell, kids are totally messed up. The phrase is not associated with a single character, but it's passed from one person to another, from camp counselor Stas, whose level of maturity is barely above that of the children, to Tanya, a younger girl from the group. Everyone at the camp considers themselves grown up, yet their actions and behaviors reveal their maturity and naivety. Considering Alosha Baranovsky, for example, who is mockingly called Baran, which means ram, He constantly emphasizes that he is a year older and stronger than others, believing this make them mere kids to him. And he's constantly saying, for goodness sake, they act like children. However, despite his effort to prove his maturity, he often joins in the group's game, forgetting about his grown-up status. Alosha is the only one in the group who reads books, specifically fairy tales. The habit is met with confusion and ridicule from his peers. So he tried to downplay it to avoid being perceived as childish. Here I'm quoting from the play. Tanya, why are you always reading? Why are you so tense? Did I ask him something wrong? Alosha, well, it's fairy tales. Tanya, fairy tales? Alosha, kind of, yeah. They called fairy tales, but they are not like the gingerbread man or, you know, those ones about the dragons, Veryna. It's actually this writer, Tanya, 1001 Nights? Alosha, sort of, yeah, just without the sex. Tanya, 1001 Nights has stuff about, well, you know, can you believe that? Alosha, yeah, I know, but 1001 Nights doesn't really appeal to me. Tanya, I found it interesting. My mom used to hide it from me, so I wouldn't read it. I couldn't understand why fairy tales would be off limits. They are supposed to be for kids. It was actually really fun. This reaction is hardly surprising, considering that the most children reading, especially fairy tales, seems strange, not something fancy, something interesting to do. And here quoting Tanya with another personage. Did you know that Baranovsky read fairy tales? Dima, no way. Tanya, believe what you want. Dima, I probably haven't read anything since I was 6, except for text messages my mate sent me. End of quote. Dima, by contrast to Alosha, presents himself quite differently. Throughout much of the play, he flirts with girls by chasing them and pulling down their knickers, a behavior that reflects their onset on puberty and a natural curiosity about the opposite sex. However, his crude approach not only exposes his immaturity, but also suggests a complete lack of manners, bordering on behavioral abnormality. To him, the best way to show his feelings is through physical fights with other boys. When he starts going out with Tanya, he declares, now I'm going to fight everyone for you. Aggression and the desire to assert dominance through physical strength, often closely linked with puberty, fuel constant fights and verbal disputes among the children, both boys and girls. Here, due to the naivety and experience of adolescence, the mechanism they have thoughtlessly adopted from the adult world become glaringly apparent. Taking Tanya, for example, aspiring to lead among the girls and thus seeking an appropriate companion, she struggles to decide between Alosha and Dima for her boyfriend. Her choices shift depends on who wins a fight. She is drawn to the strongest while betraying one or the other without hesitation to strengthen her own position. Ultimately, both boys turn away from her, deciding never to quarrel between themselves again. And here quoting, Dima, let's swap blood after breakfast in the loo. I did it with a boy in another camp, so we could be blood brothers, shall we? And let's completely stop talking to Tanya, okay? Alosha, okay. Dima, all right, mate, it's a deal. You don't need to give me back my ball. And I have that student belt of yours later. It's seriously cool. Alosha and Dima have become friends, but this final exchange reveals the nature of their friendship childishly based on material interests. The trading of clothes and possessions forms of a foundation of the most affection and conflicts among the children. Similarly, the model pupil Ola lends her talk to Tanya so she can become her friend and teach her how to socialize with her peers. This principle also underpins the children's mutual evaluation. The best, most interesting individual is the one with a cool top or wicked belt or stylish jeans. This demonstrates a materialistic, consumer-driven approach to build relations. Culmination of this mindset comes when the adolescents decide to rob the Polish children who have arrived at the camp as part of an exchange program. Notably, none of the kids expressed disapproval of the thief, quite the opposite. As one boy remarks, "My dad says, if you don't steal, you won't make it in life." This statement suggests that it would be unfair to entirely blame the children, given that their way of thinking and behaving has already been shaped by the adults and society around them. To fully reveal his characters, Pryazhko interweaves moments of games and plays, first experience of smoking, kissing, and drinking vodka with a mystical ritual, the summoning of the gnome. All the children chant, "Gnome, come forth, gnome, come forth." This scene highlights the children's longing to believe in miracles, magic, and something greater than their everyday reality. Thanks to their incantations and chocolate offerings, the gnome appears from the cupboard. The teenagers are thrilled. Each wants to stroke and feed the tiny visitor until he leaves, laden with sacks of food and sweets. As they bid farewell to the gnome, the children seem kind and carefree, brimming with warmth, happiness, and excitement. At this moment, Stas, the camp counselor, appears. Upon learning of the stranger visitor, he rushed out of the dormitory, but soon returns dragging the gnome by his collar. The mystical being turns out to be a dwarf from a nearby village, a thief. The children's frustration and fury at being deceived leads to violent beating, with their guardian instructing them on the best way how to do it. He has thus thrown a blanket over the gnome. Stas, this is called the dark one. Stas kicks the gnome under the blanket. The other children follow suit, enthusiastically joining in the attack. After the orchestral beating, Stas carried out the motionless dwarf, leaving behind a group of disappointed children who have lost their final belief in miracles and magic. Notably, however, none of them show regret or sorrow over what has happened. They effortlessly return to their usual chatter and games. In this way, the author exposes their hardness nature and the deepened corruption within them. They often justify their action with phrases like, "Honestly, we had a blast. We're still kids, for goodness sake. We've got to unwind somehow." By introducing the gnome symbolism, belief in magic and kindness, and then destroying him, Pryazhko seeks to dismount the myth of happy childhood, at least in the modern world. His own words illustrate this idea the best, here quoting from his letter. "Do you remember how in camps we always used to summon gnomes? I wanted to make the gnome a personification of a grand deception, a deception of childhood itself, because childhood, as this pure, joyful island, doesn't truly exist. There is simply a segment of time called childhood, which for some reasons is labeled happy, but it isn't defined by such categories." End of quote. Thus, the Belarusian playwright strives to present an unfiltered, unembellished truth about a generation raised in decaying society, one where betrayal, violence, and theft are acceptable for personal gain. These are children whose cliched speech and rigid thinking betray the impoverished spiritual world and lack of culture. In doing so, Pryazhko constructed kind of miniature model of the adult world, one disordered in a funhouse mirror, reflected on behavior on the youth. His conclusion is stark. A generation shaped by such a system of values is unworthy to survival. This is reinforced by the shocking ending where 9-year-old Misha massacres the entire group with automatic rifle. Importantly, he absolves himself of responsibility. Here quoting, "Everything I just did, Jesus told me to do. He came to me and said, 'Misha, wipe out all the children in the camp.' It is now 8:20 in the morning, 40 minutes until breakfast. I'm heading up to the 4th and final floor." This resolution carries a symbolic weight, the cruelty of the children, their skepticism towards kindness, their thoughtless imitation of adult behavior, and their moral and spiritual emptiness, all demand obliteration. It seems as though the heaven themselves, in the form of Christ, punishing them for killing their faith in miracles and magic, embodied by the gnome. Well, the real end is when the dwarf robbing the children while they lying, accompanied by the tune of Crocodile Gena, cheerful song. So that's why like this happy childhood is ending. And I just wanted to mention, missing some points, that while this play by Pryazhko reflects specific condition in Belarus, its theme carry universal significance as well. The play explores how young people internalize social pressures, adopting adults' behaviors long before they fully understand them, a concept central to adolescence everywhere. This is why mini-series Adolescence must be mentioned as a cinematic portrayal of modern youth, as it highlights similar struggles, showing how external influences shape identity, relationship, and morality. In Third Ship, Pryazhko deconstructs childhood, exposing its raw and often unsettling realities, far removed from the idyllic vision projected by adults. Childhood in Pryazhko world is fraught with betrayal, competition, and loss of innocence, elements that deeply resonance with the theme explored in Adolescence as well. That's why both works dismantle the myth of childhood as a time of pure happiness, instead revealing a stage of life fraught with social pressures and existential uncertainty. And with Adolescence now parts of UK Prime Minister initiative for secondary schools, its relevance is hopefully can spark some conversation about how young minds navigate their world. It's just as a Third Shift does on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And we are now moving on to our last presenter on the panel, Ulyana Veryna, Doctor of Science in Philology, who taught Belarusian and Russian literature at the Belarusian State University. Since 2022 has been working on the project Transnational Phenomena of the Literary Process of Belarus in the 1920s, 1930s at the Institute of Slavic Studies of the Karl von Ossetsky University, Oldenburg, with the support of the Felix Schwarz Initiative of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. And the topic of Ulyana today is the other own land, Belarus in non-Belarusian language literature of the 1920s to early 1930s.
Thank you.
Thank you.
for introducing.
So I will start, trying to put your presentation on, and you can start your presentation, okay?
Thank you.
Maybe you can sit here, and you have the microphone.
You have microphone.
Yeah, good.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here in this amazing and legendary place. And many thanks to all my colleagues for the brilliant presentations. Hopefully you have crafts and enthusiasm for listening me. I've proposed a very broad topic for a 15-minute talk, but I'm nearly finished with the text. So today I will focus only on the key points and will truly appreciate your feedback. But I really need my presentation for that. My presentation addresses the concept of non-Belarusian language literature of Belarus, and this issue has been discussed in relation to literature of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or in connection with post-Soviet Russian language literature. The Soviet period generally remains
outside of these discussions, but I believe that the 1920s, 1930s can be viewed from this perspective too. And the main question that interested me was how and to what extent was Belarus present in the works of non-Belarusian language authors, and what images of Belarus or Belarusians did they create. I've examined 3 examples, each in one of the non-Belarusian languages that had official status in Soviet Belarus: Yiddish, Polish, and Russian. And I hope to start with slides. The poetry and prose of Moishe Kulbak have already been integrated into the Belarusian context. Thank you so much. Kulbak was a member of the Belarusian delegation at the First Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. His novel, The Zalmenyaners, was noted as an achievement of Belarusian literature, and his name was among the first to reappear in literary circles in Minsk after his rehabilitation in 1956. His novel was translated into Belarusian by Vital Volsky and published in 1916 for the 17th anniversary. You see an invitation card for this evening. The date of the writer's death is incorrectly indicated, 1940. The real cause of his death was hidden for a long time. But the very fact that a repressed writer was honored in Minsk is noteworthy. And nowadays, the project Не расстреляны, the non-executed, included 2 Yiddish poets, Moishe Kulbak and Izzy Harik. I could say just 2 non-Belarusian poets. But it's a remarkable fact and even a tendency. Kulbak repeatedly chose Belarus as a setting for his works. I decided to compare the ways in which Belarus and Belarusians are portrayed in these works. The poem Reisen he wrote in Berlin in 1922 and the novel. In Reisen, the life of a Jewish family is presented outside of time, against the backdrop of eternal nature. The place itself is depicted as home, a kind of promised land. The father bequeaths it to his sons, not Israel, but Belarus. The love story between a Jew and a non-Jew is a plot element of both the poem and the novel. Researcher Mark Kaplan believes that the death of the grandmother in the poem is connected with the violation of custom by her sons. Only forbidden love could really break the ideal, but in the poem it is not depicted as a crime. The love between Avrom and a Belarusian girl, Nastasia, is shown by Kulbak as beautiful, set amid idyllic poetic nature. The world itself, Reisen, doesn't mean Belarus as a state, of course, but as a place of neighborhood of Litvaks, Eastern European Jews with Belarusians. And I can suppose that the central idea of Reisen is the absence of borders between the Jewish and Belarusian worlds, an idyllic shared space. A new Belarusian translation by Sergei Shupa presents the Zalmenyaners as a Minsk novel. Certain places and events are recognizable. The central place in the novel is the Reb Zalmelis courtyard. At the end of the novel, the courtyard is demolished to build the Kommunarka confectionery factory. One episode describes a demonstration during the launch of the first tram in Minsk. The novel also includes the subplot of a relationship between Sonia and a Belarusian. Unfortunately, I don't have time here to go into all the fascinating nuances of this storyline, but here are a few quotes that show how Kulbak portrays a Belarusian, emphasizing his Belarusianness. A big burly fellow who walked with heavy Belarusian steps. A bit later, he receives a Belarusian name, Pavel Alshevsky. And it is said of him that his phlegmatic face was as cloudy as a Belarusian landscape. Uncle Zisa is reluctant at first, but eventually accepts his son-in-law, while Pavel, for his part, treats the Salminianers very warmly. But there is no ideal here. Uncle Zisa dies in tragic comic circumstances related to the visit of Pavel's Belarusian peasant parents, who are described as having noses like hard potatoes. They arrive and he dies. This is shown in a grotesque manner, bordering on the absurd. There is no a shadow of grinning. Kulbak had a specific sense of humor, both in his life and in his sophisticated style. Jews were depicted also with these stylistic traits. A key difference between the poem written in Berlin and the novel written in Soviet Minsk lies in the endings. In Reisen, despite the death of the grandmother and grandfather, the family continues to exist. The many uncles remain, and the beautiful land is passed down to them. In contrast, the Salminianers' family land ceases to exist, the courtyard is demolished, and the cause of this is not the intrusion of the Belarusian world, but the advance of Soviet reality. The second part of my research focuses on a little explored area, Polish language literature, or what was known as Soviet Polonia. I was interested in the question of whether Minsk was truly a center of Polish cultural life, after Polish was recognized as one of the official languages. Sorry. I found several inconsistencies. Different sources point out the existence of a Polish section under Molodniak, the main literary organization. Even though this had been officially stated, it was never implemented. From the mid-1920s, the Polish writers were shaped centrally from Moscow. Polish language publications were distributed among Moscow, Kharkiv, and Minsk. The Polish scholar Krystyna Syrocka described the young generation of Polish writers as uncompromising young people full of enthusiasm. She also defined the main themes of their writing, such as the prosperity of the new homeland fought against the white lords of Belopani. From her point of view, they were representatives of Soviet Poles with a homeland as the Soviet Union. Among the leading young writers was Vladimir Shkovalsky. You can see a rare photograph of him from one of his books. He looks like a young romantic. That's what he was in his poems. In Kowalski's books, the poems were dated and include the place of creation, which allowed me to trace his creative geography. It turned out that his most proper Soviet and propagandistic poems are connected with Belarus, while his more emotional ones are dedicated to other places, especially to Ukrainian cities, Praskurev, where he lived, now Khmelnytsky and Kharkiv. Our land, our birds, for which the battle with the Belopani is fought, is above all peasant land. And the place itself, though described through natural metaphors, is the red Berezina, meaning it belongs to a specific class. In the poem Aquarela, the nocturnal romantic landscape is an idyllic depiction of kolkhoz land. Addressing it, the poet uses three descriptors, my, kolkhoz, and homeland, in the same line as equals. The date and place of creation leave no doubt that this Pekna Otchizna, beautiful homeland, refers to the new Soviet fatherland designated for Poles within the borders of the Soviet Union. I mean the Dzhinsky Polish National District, Dzhinsk, 1934. It can be assumed that Belarus was a place where Kowalski hoped to realize himself. He received a really high position, was the head of the Polish department of the Belarusian radio. His life was tragically short. He was arrested and executed at 25. And at the moment of his death, his play was being prepared for the stage in Minsk, and a new collection of poems was ready for publication. But his connection with Belarus was still being established. Progress had not yet become strong. And the third episode in my research, which I found especially interesting, concerns the brief existence of the group Minsky Pereval and its only book, The Dearest Scene, Самое родное. Minsky Pereval emerged in 1927 in the context of a broader split among literary groups who opposed the dictates of proletarian literature. It was the Russian language counterpart to Belarusian language group Проблеск, Пролетарско-Солянская литературная суполка, which united poets who sought to compose rural and landscape poetry. The image of the homeland is central to the book, with the recurring opposition between city and village, and many of the poems imitate the Yesenin style. Yesenin style was a strong poison for many young poets of those years. The book represents a unique case of such imitation. The poets wrote about Belarus, the Belarusian village, and nature in Yesenin style and in Russian. As a result, instead of expressing something deeply personal, deeply emotional, as the title suggests, самое родное, the borrowed style reveals a lack of a distinct artistic language to articulate love for the homeland, distinguished from Yesenin's Rus. The Belarusian component in this artistic rendering, toponyms, dialectism, becomes a means of minor ethnographic distinction characteristic of colonial discourse, of course. And my conclusions, several minutes, 2 minutes. Brief conclusion. From Ulbak's perspective, Belarus lost its idyllic quality due to the emergence of new borders and a new regime, which assumed that the land now belonged not to Belarusians or Jews, but to the youth. An English translation, Выпасnebs, translation by Sergei Shupa, Shalaputy, new young generation, who were integrating into the new system and following the laws, not of their lineage, but of their time. For example, the young Zelmenyaners, Falka and Tonke, Tonke and Falke, the children of blood brothers, went to Vladivostok and became husband and wife. Kulbak couldn't find a home even after bringing with him to Soviet Minsk his portable homeland, as a Rachel Silik named the Belarusian landscape to which he had dedicated many poems. Neither a home nor a native land existed anymore. The hope of the new generation of Soviet Poles to find their own land in the autonomy granted to them proved illusory because it didn't become national and was not truly autonomous, as envisioned at the founding of the Soviet Union. It could only function as a kind of reservation with ethnographic features, but even that possibility was denied in the case of Polish culture due to the mass repressions that destroyed the Soviet Polish population in 1937. And the Russian language experience showed that with the adoption of Russian patriotic stylistics, this land came to be described as White Rus, in other words, as a colonized part of the Great Russian territories. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We've now had 5 fantastic papers and look forward to the discussion. The floor is open for Q&A. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, please. You do?
My question is for Alana. It says it's on the side of that, right? My question is for Alana. So you mentioned the idea of intended miscommunication, maybe even strategic miscommunication. I thought that was pretty interesting. And I think Bakhushevich prose is pretty layered. It's pretty complex. I think it's pretty difficult to understand even to somebody who's a cultural insider, myself, for instance, right? But then there is a question of translating it, right, into English, for example, of which there is a translation that exists. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, right? Does the intent behind the miscommunication carry through when a work like that is translated into English, right? Or does the intention get lost while the miscommunication and the confusion remain? And does it actually help, maybe, right, to like a non-native to understand the meaning behind the work?
Speak really loudly. No, that's actually, it's a super good question. And it's the reason I thought about writing this paper was because I was asked to write a review of the translation and I had a terrible time understanding it. Because if you haven't read the translation of that book in English or haven't looked at it, it's in Scots, which, you know, as an American English speaker, I never hear Scots in my daily life. And it's something very unfamiliar to me. And I think also to people living in the UK, it's fairly difficult to comprehend unless you grew up hearing it and speaking it. And so that's what made me think about this question of like when, like the limitations of translation, but also like maybe miscommunication just is the intention to a certain degree in this book. And I think that this particular translation did a good job of preserving this intended misunderstanding or this sort of narrative strategy of misunderstanding that I'm arguing for, because readers read it and they can never comprehend all of it. So I think it actually is a perfect example of this. I mean, people can quibble with the way certain things were done. There was insertions of a lot of different like lyric moments in the translation that weren't in the original that I found a little confusing. But all in all, I think this was a well done translation that sort of preserved the spirit of the text and this narrative strategy, and didn't try to promote this sort of, it preserved that opacity, right? The right to opacity that I was saying that Bakhushevich is kind of creating through his narrative strategy, it preserved that. And so I think that that impact comes through. I don't think that the book is going to sell as well for that reason, but books aren't, maybe they shouldn't be written to sell well. I don't know. That's a different conversation, right? If we are evaluating an historic and publishing, so I do think about this, right? But if we're evaluating books based on how well they'll sell, that's a different question. That book's not going to sell well. It's not going to read as wide a readership because it's hard to read. But yeah. Yeah. I mean, when I worked in publishing, I would have been like, this is an awesome project and really cool, but it's going to reach a very small number of readers. But that's okay, I think, too. I mean, it still needs to be written. And for those who do read it, they understand that Belarus has a complicated linguistic history that so many people don't know, right? So, yeah. Exactly, yeah.
The other mic, by the way. Okay.
Oh.
Anyone? Yeah, Pavel?
And just to continue, is that the only reason why it would be difficult to sell, or do you think there's some sort of Western readers will find it culturally alien generally, if it's sort of even perfectly translated? Do you think it's like an average? I mean, to what extent? No, to what extent he kind of raises international, I don't know, ideas and issues that, people generally find interesting, as opposed to kind of purely Belarusian context that you need to be sort of an insider. Yeah.
It got reviewed in the New York Times. So this book got a prominence that I think previous Belarusian authors haven't seen. I mean, there have been English translations before this. But I think, yeah, you know more about this than I do, so. Yeah.
I can add a little bit on that topic. So the publishing house which produced that book, it's based in Scotland, and they had particular interest in exploring intercultural kind of options, connections. And that translation was supported by the English pen, obviously without support from financial support, as you said. Probably that book wouldn't appeal to a publisher which has to survive. And that's probably how literature exists. So there is a whole infrastructure supporting different ways for literature too.
I have thought about, like, what if we tried to translate this for an American audience? Because that book just isn't going to sell well in most US markets because it's so hard to read. And we were talking about this yesterday, and I was like, what equivalent American English, dialect could I use? I still haven't quite come up with an answer, but it's something I have thought about. I think it's nonetheless a really rich way of communicating the complexity of Belarusian culture and history. That's kind of the whole. I think that's one of the biggest contributions of this novel. And I think that the fact that it was even translated to begin with, it just opened that conversation up. So I'm thankful to toBaharevič for doing that. And his translators. With that, or I was thinking, like, there's Creole, so New Orleans, the kind of mix of French that we have as well. So there's a lot of options, but they're just a little different. It's a different cultural context, but.
My comment is, I think it was also reissued in the US, right? Sort of this book with new directions. Is it the same translation? There is no adaptation? It's the same text. Okay. And my follow-up actually is sort of based on this a little bit, right? I've heard some folks comment in the past, right, that maybe a lot of, especially contemporary Belarusian literature, is sort of written for the Belarusian reader, right? It kind of pushes away the outsider, right? Somebody, I've heard somebody call it like as possessing a certain provincialism in that sense, right? It's sort of intended for a small audience, right? And I've seen some reviews from Western, like, literary reviewers saying sort of the same thing. I wanted to kind of maybe get some of your thoughts on that too.
Yeah. It is something I've thought about. It's something I want to eventually do, is translate from Belarusian into English. And whenever my Belarusian gets better, I have a tutor. And it is a question that I have, like, will English language readers want this? Like, is this going to be something they can understand? And I think that the market is there. I think it might require creative translation methods that aren't maybe more adaptations than pure translation. But I think we do have to give credit. There is a certain group of readership that wants different things, right? They want to learn and understand other things. I don't think that's a lot of readers. It's certainly not going to be the ones that they're in the airport and they pick up a book. Those aren't the readers we're appealing to. Yeah, so I think that definitely does exist in Belarusian literature. In short, yes, it does sort of have a smaller target audience, but the only way that audience is going to get bigger is if we do these translations and see who's willing to read. I don't know. I mean, I think that's a different type of writing, right? Like, I think that can happen, but we can't abandon. I mean, I'm not part of this we, so I shouldn't use we. Belarusians should not abandon writing for their audience, to reach out to a global audience. That would be not preserving this opacity. That would be sort of taking away their own, your right to opacity, which I think is really important. Like, Belarusians have a right to have their identity and be misunderstood by the world. You don't need to appeal to everybody, and maybe clearly, like, totally understandable. So I think that's, yeah. So I would say, no, don't change strategies in that regard, because I would be very sad. Yeah, do both. I mean, yeah, and work with translators and authors that can do interesting adaptations and do those sort of cross-border communications. That's where I think the magic happens.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just to develop that point about provincial audience of this literature, this kind of literature, I have a question to Maria. Do you think Pavel Pryazhko, his audience, is universal? I mean, what is the difference in the context between his play, his literary space, and say The Lord of the Flies? Could it be written anywhere else in the world, speak to anyone else? And if also, what is there anything Belarusian about it, specifically Belarusian?
I thank you for the question. I think Pavel is writing, first of all, as observer of modern society. However, many topics he moving, and well, this one of the most polite play he wrote. Usually, the language is different. But actually, the brilliant observation of tendencies and what's happening, he never, I think, active person who would move forward and give a lecture or lessons what you should do, how you should live. He just producing those observations. And well, like in this, we had adolescence. I think it was quite a big deal. The topic moves. So that's a play, for example, was written in 2007. So maybe if it would be more well known, adolescence also would come maybe earlier, because I think those dialogues are very important. And especially for me, for example, my own experience moving from Belarus first to Poland and then to UK, my way of seeing things changed a lot since then. And this is very, I think, communicating with those miscommunications, or well, in our methodology, we used to call it filling white points, because they are always present in all works. So filling those white spots depends on our, I think, well, it's called in Russian, генеративно-перцептивная база. So it's a generic perceptive base. So if you have same of as a nation, maybe, or a generation or group, you will see also this work similar or same way. And if you have the different backgrounds, different life experiences, different things you grow up, like, for example, in this play, we have Crocodile Gena song, which cannot be translated, that just for those, but everyone who knows that will hear that song immediately in their heads, I guess. But someone who doesn't, it can be anything, just silly song. That's what those feelings. So Pryazhko, if you would take as in concepts of misunderstandings, let's say, I think he is quite universal. He touches a lot of tendencies in societies. However, some plays are very much also based and grounded in the Belarus reality. However, if I may add, I mentioned before that he belongs to this Belarusian phenomenon in dramaturgy. It's group of very talented people like Konstantin Steshik, Nikolai Rudkovsky, well, Pryazhko, obviously, and many others. They actually not really exist in Belarus theaters, or they doesn't exist in publishing houses. They barely known, actually. However, they're very widely known in Russia. However, after that war, it's also changed, because Pryazhko almost stopped being shown in Russia. Belarus completely threw him away. Same as Diana Baliko, another playwright who first immigrated, her husband actually was a prisoner for 1 month, I think, after protest. Then they first immigrated to Ukraine and then to Poland. So after that, her play, which been part of the school program, has been thrown away. The whole school program has been reshaped for literacy. So, well, I think each country has some of that background as well. Well, or some countries do have countries, some not. So to say if it's universal, I think it's can be interested for some countries more, for some maybe less, but definitely there are universal topics.
Thank you.
I think like Hanna's poetry, like everyone feels that's a mother and that sort of relation, despite even gender, I think. So thank you.
Any more questions? Are there any questions online? Yes.
If you could use this mic.
Yeah, I'm curious about this Yiddish writer. You, I think, didn't mention. So, was he born in Belarus? What is his relation to Belarus? Was he born in Belarus? Because you mentioned that he wrote something in Berlin, and something in Belarus, and then did he go back and forth? Or what exactly was his relation? But also, two others, they all also were born in Belarus, but were kind of going around, or the two others were in Belarus?
Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your question. Moishe Kulbak is the most famous Yiddish writer who was born in the territory of the contemporary Belarus. Really, his biography had many places. He was a really superstar of poetry in Vilnius, in Vilna. He lived in Berlin, and then he returned to Vilna, and then he chose Soviet Belarus and Soviet Minsk, and it was a tragically decision for him. His poetry, his works, his prose has large attention from especially American scholars, because he was published in American magazines, American publishing houses. Due to the circumstances, he became famous in very wide circles.
And Yiddish.
Really, yes, exactly.
And how did he die? You didn't mention that.
He was executed in 1937.
Oh, he was executed.
Yes.
But it was covered up because you
Yes.
mentioned the date 1940, yeah? Why did they give the wrong
It was a mistake. 1940. I paid attention because the real reason of his die was hidden for a long time. His daughter Raya Kulbak didn't know for many years about the circumstances of his death. Her father.
May I have a question?
Yeah.
I would like to ask a question Natallia, if that's okay, because we had discussion here about I think translation Bakhushevich to English. How it looks like in German? If you're based in Graz, probably you are very knowledgeable for that. Is that translation is? I think is Bakhushevich himself lives in also Graz or Austria. I'm not sure if he moved. Maybe he also took a part in shaping this translation, or maybe you can give some comments. Thank you.
Вибачте, я вам откажу по-білоруську, мені так простіше, я думаю, що всі розуміють, у нас же все ж таки конференції по білорусістиці. Коли ви будете глядіти на переклади, перше, що у нас завжди саме цікаве, це Вікіпедія. І ви можете побачити там вельми шмат варіантів написання прозвища самого Бахаревича. І він має вельми давню проблему у Німеччині з гэтым написанням, тому що чуж і гэтай гукі, зноў ж транслітерацыя можа быць рознай. І яшчэ одна праблема, якая ёсць, гэта праблема лацінкі, тому што Бахаревич у нас вельмі любіць правобраз лацінкі, які паходзіць з 20-х гадоў. Але латинка зараз адаптаваная рознымі варыянтамі. Я думаю, што тут могуць спецыялісты больш за мяне расказаць. І калі вы паглядзіце на пераклады Бахарэвіча на нямецкую мову, канешне, гэта заўсёды адаптацыя. І на пачатку гэтыя пераклады былі з расійскай мовы. І таму гэта былі пераклады не аўтэнтычныя, не беларускацэнтрычныя. Алана, я думаю, таксама можа пра гэта расказаць шмат. І зараз мне здаецца, што поспех, апошні поспех, калі мы пабачым пераклад «Сабакі Еўропы», гэта ўпершыню тэкст, які перакладзены з беларускай мовы дакладна. Адзінае, гэта вельмі цікавая рэч, калі ўжо гаварыць пра тэму майго даследавання. Нямецкі перакладчык Томас Вайлер, ён проста беларускую частку Балбуты ён праігнараваў. Карацей кажучы, калі вы возьмеце тэкст «Сабак Еўропы» па-беларуску, вы атрымаеце там цэлую частку твора на Балбуце. А калі вы возьмеце нямецкі пераклад, вы атрымаеце толькі 3 старонкі на Балбуце. Таму што, я думаю, што нямецкі чытач не павінен проста стамляцца ад чытання на Балбуце. І другая розніца, якая ў нас атрымалася, гэта з таго, што я бачу, першапачаткова слоўнік Балбуты быў вельмі маленькі, але нямецкі перакладчык, які, зразумела, вывучыў Балбуту і зараз будзе пісаць у CV, ён валодае Балбутай таксама, ён зрабіў слоўнік нашмат большы, і зараз гэта ўжо не 10 сторонак, а такая свая вялікая сістэма. Такім чынам, нямецкія пераклады дапамагаюць нам развіваць бальбутызм па-за межамі Беларусі. Гэта так іранічна, канешне, але так больш дакладна.
Дякую.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question for Hanna. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very moving to hear your poetry as well as your analysis. I think that there is a common thread uniting quite a few presentations on this panel, and that's resistance, resisting totalizing discourse of the empire. And I wonder how, resisting creation of a perfect state, Belarus being a state of losers, and how would those ideas, could they be translated into your relational aesthetics and not creating a perfect mother, and maybe some tension between misunderstanding a strategy and understanding a strategy? So what literary strategies do you employ? It's a lot of questions.
It's a lot of questions, and I already forgot what you asked. Because my work is so multi-layered, but I do focus from the very beginning, thanks to my supervisors, who, from my submission of the draft, proposal, suggested that this work would be a great contribution to decolonizing academia. Not because it's Belarusian work, not necessarily because it's Belarusian work, but because it's autoethnography, which is part of this decolonizing academia movement, which states that personal experience is valid enough to be a source of data, it is a reliable source of data. But also because it's feminist, which says that, okay, women have the right to interpret their own experience, and they're capable of that, and it's valid as well. And it's because, academia is quite still traditional and patriarchal. You are supposed to write in a dry, unemotional, detached style, not include yourself. It's like you and your research are two separate things, which I absolutely cannot do. It would be a torture for me. My supervisors made sure that I'm aware, and I became hugely aware of it while I was doing the submitted the ethical kind of proposal, for the ethics committee to have conversations with my mother and sister, and to be able to include those conversations into my research. I learned a lot about actually what I write doesn't matter if that hurts my close people or other people more than it benefits them. And I think it's the opposite of totalitarian, because to kind of this authoritarian approach would be, no, my writing is the most important thing. What I want to write, my ideas, I see it this way and I want to share it. But it's like, no, if they disagree, you know, I have to accept it. If they don't want, even after I've like written these poems, if my mom says, sorry, I don't feel comfortable, I don't want people to see me this way that you show me, because maybe this is not who I am. You know, there are ways I can go around it. And yeah, I don't know if I'm answering your question, because it's a huge conversation. Not sure we have time for that. I'm happy to talk about it afterwards as well. But yeah, there's like, even when I had to, for the ethics, I had to show my mom and sister the consent form and the description of the project. And my initial reaction was, oh my God, I know, it's so complicated. They're very simple people and they don't have higher education. You know, my mom only has school education. And I thought they are not gonna understand what's about. I felt so ashamed afterwards, because they did in their own way. And you know, that's the point of it as well.
Fascinating. Thank you. Any other questions from, yes?
I just wanted to ask, I know that autoethnography as like a genre is pretty new in terms of like the way it's being written about, but I mean, I'm sure it's existed in forms earlier, right? And I was wondering, like, have you seen in your acquaintance with like, you know, other Belarusian writers writing now, or like historically, have you seen elements of autoethnography in Belarusian literature or a movement in it like currently? Do you see yourself fitting in to like a larger autoethnographic trend in Belarus or not?
Well, I do think that a lot of Belarusian poetry is autoethnographic, contemporary poetry, particularly women's poetry. Yeah. We just don't call it. I didn't know that autoethnography exists until, you know, I opened the University of Brighton's page with PhD programs that they support, and so autoethnography, oh my God, I'm rescued, you know. There is a word for it. And yeah, a lot of Belarusian women's, in particular contemporary poetry, is autoethnographic. But I've never really discussed it with my fellow poets. Yeah, maybe we should organize a panel on that in the next conference.
Yeah, I think that there's something there, I think, that could, like, a broader study of Belarusian autoethnography could be really cool. So.
I'd love to have more of these conversations, because I feel quite still, I don't know, this very personal to share, but I do feel like an outcast in academia, because like I'm not an academic. And then how do I talk about this to proper academics, but also to Belarusian who like, what is she doing there, you know?
I still feel like an outsider too. I think that's part of the academic experience.
If I can add, it's very interesting in theater. It exists already for a while. One of the very, I think, well, Pryazhko wrote Хозяин кофейни. It hasn't been translated, so please be pleased with the original title. And for example, Verypayev Kislorod, so the Occident, where he expressed his views in a form of rap, which is very interesting, and it's like monologues of the performance. And before that, there was a few others who I think it comes then everyone knows stand-up comedy in some point, or stand-up genre. So I think it's could be quite some people using poetry for that. Some goes together with the music. Well, if we can consider rap as a music and poetry like mixture. So it's been already presented. Maybe you should more also go to our theater. Will be interesting experience.
I think Alexeyevich, of course, you know, with her interviewing people, bringing in the emotions into history writing is a parallel development, showing that many historical phenomena can be understood without accounting for traumas and emotions. And each person whom she interviews, she of course has small snippets, but each person whom she interviews for 6-8 hours is engaged in kind of autoethnography, out of which she then does something else. Yeah.
Mhm.
But I
Exactly.
do think it's extremely important for history writing too, because
Yeah,
we
because
were not allowed, to
yeah,
account for emotions. Yeah.
Interesting. We have to separate usually.
exactly. But then
Absolutely.
if a human story doesn't matter, then what matters? It's like you cannot exclude humans are living history and making it. How then you exclude a human story, then what's left? I think maybe that's why we are not learning from history.
Yeah.
We can't learn
yeah.
from pure facts or like only from them. People, empathy needs to be involved in that, and that's what autoethnography can do. It can arise empathy along with providing the kind of solid, more rational context and thinking.
Especially what she did with the failure of Soviet Union and why the democracy couldn't be built out in those regions. Yeah, you can explain it only through psychology, not through history, not through the events. It was an ingenious intervention through the bringing in these narratives, and they're serious. It's not. It's facts. It's emotional facts. Why they were excluded. Without them, yeah, we can't write and understand culture and history and anything.
I think too, I mean, just to very briefly bring it back to what I presented on, I think that this autoethnographic message is in a way declaring a right to misunderstanding or opacity because we're not relying on these so-called facts, right? Like verifiable documents and things like that, right? And so there's this kind of, you're writing from your own perspective, people have to kind of believe you or not believe you in that way. And so it's this right to tell your story the way you want to.
Yeah, and that's like, for me, that's why it's so important that I'm not just telling my story, I involve my mom and sister, and we, all the three of us, so we shared them, like we experienced the same domestic violence, factually, but from each of us in her own way. And
Yeah.
it's so important to show those different ways. For me, it's probably the worst, like, it's a huge, then my sister takes it easier, and our mom is she has completely her own story, which is even more complicated, and it's so important to show them all. So then when this writing reaches people, and that's the point of autoethnography and my way of writing, which I believe is accessible, or I try to make it accessible, that different people read it and also recognize themselves, because the psychological validation is super important for healing, actually.
Yeah.
I just now better than I did during my presentation.
Well, that's the point. I also had thoughts that it's psychological overcome of certain trauma, but also for me, it's a very important, I think, tendency for Belarusians to come out with their own stories, because we always, used to be taught, sit quiet, do not show yourself too much, or that sort of mentality, be like among of others, because those best were, we know the history. And I think this is very important, what you're doing to make it more, I don't know if it's generational thing, what do you think? Or is it just your own, how would you say, if it's like, you would match to the whole generation? Or because I think next, like the millennials or alphas, they really come out much louder comparing to other generations, definitely with their experiences, with their self-awareness.
I think if they do, then it's thanks to the previous generations, to those people and groups of people in the previous generation who weren't quiet, but for whom it was so brave, really, really brave and daring. So now those generations, they don't have to face that much shame anymore for that. Yeah, like it's very shameful for a lot of people to talk about domestic violence that they experienced, right? It should not be this way. But for you to not feel that way, someone has to validate this for you, to say this is not shameful. And possibly several generations, have to repeatedly and publicly, actually, and that's what literature does. It publicly validates your experience as not shameful. And being a victim of that is not normal. Yeah, not normal, but also not shameful. Yeah.
maybe we should finish some more.
It's quite optimistic.
Yeah.
It looks like it's part of the healing process that at the level of the nation we need to go through, but we also need to go through that individually. And it's beautiful to have it present in the academia, in the academic discourse, that journey. Thank you very much. We've had a very interesting panel and a lively discussion. Thank you. Would you like to?
Maybe if I can sit instead of Hanna, our other camera the battery has died. I hope you still have energy for second part of this day, which will be less serious, more fun, but also learning experience, particularly for those who have never been at the Belarusian Library and Museum across the road. But I think the conference has been a success, the 10th anniversary, because there were more people than we ever had, with very diverse presentations covering all sorts of topics, an excellent keynote. We had people from different continents, and some have already published in the Journal of Belarusian Studies, some will do it. And we also established connections with other people. And just on this panel, several people agreed that sometimes doing Belarusian studies is quite isolating. You feel like you are on your own, you're a bit of an outcast, and very weird. So I hope this event brings together similar people, so you don't feel alone anymore. We hope that there will also be ways to cooperate between you and the library and the museum. You, as Pavel will say later, we cooperate with researchers who come here to stay to conduct their research, be it just at the library or also at other parts of London and at the libraries, focusing on Belarusian studies. And we had an excellent presentation about various ways how you can present virtual space, and so something also for us as library trustees to consider in the future. And in any event, I hope these were £10 very well spent, and we still have our lunch, and then we'll have a tour of the library and the museum, and also of the church. And those of you who want, they can also stay for the liturgy. Is it at 5 p.m.?
5:30.
At 5:30 p.m. at the Belarusian church. Yeah, so we look forward to staying in touch with you, and it was really a pleasure to host you. So let me conclude the official part of the conference, and hope to see you and your publications, your presentations, and we will process the panels of this conference and we'll publish bits of it on YouTube. So that's another way how to widen our, the accessibility of our research and to have an impact. Yeah. Thank you very much, Karalina. Also to all people who helped, volunteers, trustees of the library, Father Search, whom you may or may not see, will see. Certainly, if you go to the church, you will see him. Thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of the day.